Welcome, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled to have you join me for today's explainer. We're going to dive right in and set the stage for exploring the fascinating, deeply complex geography and history of India's northeastern region. We're going to unpack exactly how historical lines, literally just drawn on a map, have fundamentally shaped the modern reality for millions of people. It's an incredible story of cartography, conflict, and a massive push for modern connectivity.
But before we get to the modern day, I want to pose this question to you. Think about this for a second. How did a region so profoundly rich in culture become so historically isolated? I mean, we are talking about a vibrant area that boasts over 200 indigenous tribes, including the Naga, Khasi, Garo, Mizo, and Bodo, just to name a few, alongside some of the most incredible biodiversity on the entire planet. And yet, despite all this immense wealth, it has a deeply fractured geopolitical past.
Okay, let's dive into this. Today we're covering Section 1, Meet the Seven Sisters. Section 2, A Legacy of Drawn Borders. Section 3, Decades of Insurgency. Section 4, Analyzing the Security Data. And finally, Section 5, India's Look East Policy.
Section 1. Meet the Seven Sisters, Geographic and Cultural Wealth. So to really understand this region's history, we first need to ground ourselves in its present-day layout. You'll often hear the phrase Seven Sisters. It was coined back in 1972 to highlight the incredibly close ties between these contiguous states: Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, Manipur, Meghalaya, Mizoram, Nagaland, and Tripura. Now, the main takeaway here is their strategic location. This entire block of states shares international borders with 4 different countries. We're talking China, Bhutan, Myanmar, and Bangladesh. It is geopolitically critical.
And this number right here brilliantly illustrates just how precarious that geography actually is. 22 kilometers. That is the entire width of the incredibly narrow Siliguri corridor, which is located in West Bengal and is very often called the chicken snack. This tiny, tiny strip of land is the only physical connection these 7 states have to mainland India. Just imagine the logistical and honestly the psychological impact of being tethered to your own country by such a fragile thread.
Section 2. A Legacy of Drawn Borders, the Impact of Colonial Cartography.
To understand the physical and political isolation we just talked about, we actually have to zoom out and look at colonial cartography. Back in 1907, Lord Curzon, fresh from his time in India, noted that in Asia, there has always been a strong instinctive aversion to the acceptance of fixed boundaries. He frankly admitted that demarcation has never taken place except under European pressure. You see, colonial mapmaking consciously disrupted traditional, pre-colonial connectivities. It basically took a region with fluid identities and nomadic habits and just forced it into rigid, unnatural boxes.
And we can see this disruption play out in a series of very deliberate actions. The British East India Company drew borders mostly for resource extraction, like, securing a monopoly on lime quarries in the Khasi Jayantia foothills. In 1834, the Pemberton Line was drawn in Manipur, and perhaps most impactfully, the 1947 partition of Sylhet, which mostly went to East Pakistan, effectively cut off vital traditional transit routes. Actually, these weren't just lines on a map, right? They severed families, local economies, and centuries of shared demographic history.
And the thing is, these internal borders were in a state of flux for decades, even after India's independence. So Assam became a state in 1950, but the map just kept shifting. Nagaland followed in 1963. Meghalaya, Manipur, and Tripura in 1972, and finally Arunachal Pradesh and Mizoram in 1987. The political map was constantly being carved and recarved.
Section 3. Decades of Insurgency, the Security Environment.
Now, we have to look at the grim realities that resulted from this incredibly isolated, ethnically partitioned, and constantly shifting environment. There is a sheer visual density to the Ministry of Home Affairs documents that really speaks volumes. There are numerous insurgent organizations declared as unlawful associations. Historically, when you mix difficult terrain with tribal rivalries, struggles for control over local resources, and highly porous international borders, you get a very fragile security situation. And this directly led to the rise of various Indian insurgent groups across Assam, Manipur, Meghalaya, Tripura, and Nagaland.
Section 4. Analyzing the Security Data, Mapping the Decline of Violence.
So, how has this fragile situation evolved in recent times? Well, let's look at the raw data. If we track the macro trend for the entire northeastern region from 2004 onwards, looking specifically at extremists killed and arrested, a really clear pattern emerges.
Back in 2004, over 1,000 extremists were arrested, but by the late 2010s and early 2020s, those numbers had plummeted into the hundreds or even double digits in some areas. Broadly speaking, across the entire region, there's been a massive, noticeable decline in overall insurgency-related incidents over the last 2 decades.
But, and this is a crucial point, while the macro trend is going down, we always have to look at the localized data too. When we look at statewide security data specifically for Manipur, the recent years, 2023 and 2024, show a distinct spike in incidents and arrests compared to the years immediately prior. It's important to note that according to the explicit footnote provided in the ministry's data, this recent increase in violence is primarily attributed strictly to ethnic strife within Manipur, rather than the traditional, region-wide insurgency movements of the past.
Section 5. India's Look East Policy. Reconnecting the region.
So, how do you solve a problem that's rooted in centuries of geographic and political isolation? Enter India's Look East policy. Academic literature describes this policy as a real imaginative leap in foreign, defense, and internal security policy. It completely reimagines the Northeast. Instead of viewing it as this isolated, volatile borderland, the policy envisions the region as a vital, thriving hub for connectivity, trade, and tourism with India's South Asian neighbors.
And we are actually seeing this policy in action right now through modern multilateral agreements, like the Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Nepal Motor Vehicles Agreement, often just called the BBIMVA. Now, these aren't just dry bureaucratic treaties. They are active, physical steps toward restoring the very transit routes that were severed during those partitions of the 19th and 20th centuries. It's literally an attempt to stitch back together what colonial cartography tore apart.
Which leaves us with a final, profound thought to ponder as we wrap up. We've seen how deeply borders can isolate a region, and we've walked through the data on the resulting decades of conflict. The real question now is, will initiatives like the Look East policy and these new multilateral transit agreements ultimately overcome the heavy legacy of divided nations? Can new roads actually rewrite old maps? It's an absolutely fascinating geopolitical space to watch. Thank you so much for exploring this data and history with me today. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.
To reach India's eastern states, you squeeze through the 22-kilometer Siliguri corridor. Past it, the geography expands into 80,000 square miles of rainforests and 200 distinct tribes. The region shares massive borders with 4 nations, yet remains tethered by one narrow thread. When an area is physically severed from its nation's economic center, development often stalls. Over decades, this physical distance contributed to a deep sense of alienation from the central government in New Delhi. This document from the Ministry of Home Affairs catalogs the results of that long-term isolation. It lists numerous insurgent organizations operating across the Northeast, groups like ULFA in Assam and the PLA in Manipur, which turned to armed conflict to demand local autonomy. In the Seven Sisters, extreme geography and isolation converged, creating a landscape where physical detachment became the foundation for decades of armed friction. Before European powers arrived, the concept of a demarcated frontier barely existed in Asia. Geography was defined by nomadic movement, fluid zones of influence, and seasonal migration. In that system, the Northeast operated as a bustling continental crossroads, linking the economies of South and Southeast Asia. The British introduced a European obsession: rigid, demarcated borders. They surveyed the terrain to draw hard lines, securing monopolies over local resources. Imposing fixed boundaries on a landscape built on movement fractured the regional economy. The connectivity that defined the space was severed. Mapmaking became a primary tool of colonial control. Surveyors meticulously recorded the topography, drawing lines that dictated who controlled the revenue. Starting in the 1820s, British expeditions pushed into the Khasi Jayantia foothills. By 1834, they drew the Pemberton Line, asserting colonial control over the Manipur frontier. This was disruptive cartography. To extract resources efficiently, colonial administrators drew boundaries that cut right through contiguous tribal lands. Indigenous populations woke up divided and abruptly reclassified. Archival records often label these groups with hostile terms, instantly marginalizing them on their ancestral land. The 1947 partition finalized the region's isolation. Awarding Sylhet to East Pakistan severed the Northeast's established transit routes to the sea, creating a geopolitical dead end. The later armed insurgencies were not spontaneous. They were a delayed reaction by communities whose lands and economies were systematically dismantled by colonial maps. This data table tracks the security situation in the Northeast over recent years. Look at the numbers from 2004 down to 2020. Incidents of violence, civilian casualties, and kidnappings drop remarkably over this 16-year period. The decline is not uniform. The recent ethnic strife in Manipur, reflected here in the localized spikes for 2023 and 2024, shows that these historical divides still carry dangerous weight today. Yet the broader regional trend is undeniable. Since the physical geography hasn't changed, we have to look at the specific policy shifts that are finally addressing the tension. The Indian government recognized that stabilizing the Seven Sisters required addressing their geographic isolation. They introduced the Look East and later Act East policy. This relies on specific diplomatic mechanisms like the Motor Vehicles Agreement between Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Nepal. The goal is to bypass the constraints of the Siliguri corridor. By opening new transit and trade routes directly to neighboring countries, the Northeast bypasses the bottleneck entirely. It reclaims its historical role as a connected crossroads. Borders are physical interventions that can sever a region's economic arteries. Solving the tensions in the Seven Sisters means looking past the lines on a map to restore the connectivity they originally broke.